Here we are with the fifth and final video of Lecture 19. I know it's been a long one, but it's an important one, and it makes up for not having any lectures last week. And so let's talk a little bit about the Flavian Dynasty and what happens under them. And so who are the Flavian Dynasty? Of course, the Flavian Dynasty is named after the Flavian family, or the Flavian family, which is of course Vespasian's family. Okay? And so let's talk a little bit about them. And so Vespasian, of course, was born in the year 9 CE, and he lived to the year 79 CE, meaning that he lived for 70 years, right? And of course, he was emperor from the year 69 CE to the year 79 CE for a total of 10 years. And so he, of course, became emperor during the year of the four emperors, or almost 2 years of the four emperors, right? But before that, he had been a commander of the legions in Syria and had been putting down the Jewish Great Revolt. And when he marches on Rome and defeats Vitellius, or his troops defeat Vitellius, his troops then proclaim him as emperor, and he starts the Flavian Dynasty, his family's new ruling period. And so the Flavian Dynasty is going to be first starting with him and then include both of his sons, Titus and Domitian. Both of them will rule on their own, and we'll talk about each of them in this video as well. So of course the Flavian Dynasty is 3 emperors: Vespasian, Titus, Domitian. Moving on. He was a member of the equestrian class, which is quite interesting. All the previous ones had been patricians, or had even been members of the royal family, which had been also obviously patricians, members of the patrician class. But he is an equestrian, that class slightly below the patricians, right? He had actually a very normal domestic life as well. He actually loved his wife, unlike several of the past emperors, which had wives that usually cheated on them, or hated them, or tried to kill them, or did kill them in some cases, and things like that. So he actually had a loving wife and a loving family. In fact, while he was sometimes on military campaign, his wife kind of tried to do things and keep things going in Rome for him. She was quite educated. Moving on, he also, along with his wife, had 2 children, not from previous marriages or anything like that, but between the 2 of them. And they, of course, were Titus, the older son, and Domitian, the younger one. And we'll talk about each of them in a bit. Titus, of course, helped him on military campaign all the way in Syria. Now, of course, the civil war of the debt of the 4 emperors caused quite a lot of debt. The year of the 4 emperors was quite a big civil war, even though it was only a year to 2 years long. It was constant fighting, okay? And fighting in the city of Rome itself, or right outside the city of Rome, and all of that fighting caused a lot of debt, okay? And so Vespasian decided that he was going to solve that debt problem by raising money by instituting a new tax, and that new tax was on urinals, actual urinals. And so if you know what a urinal is, you're in good shape, right? It's a bathroom, right? It's a place to go urine, go pee. And so they had public urinals throughout the city of Rome, as well as in other Roman cities throughout the entire empire. And they were public service buildings. They were made by the government for people to be able to use the restroom whenever they needed to, as opposed to rushing home or something like that. And so it cost quite a bit of money to build these things. However, they had already been built, and he realized that they had been a free service. Let's make it a little bit of a tax, a little bit of amount of money just to pay. So you would have to pay a single denarii or part of a denarii or something every time you wanted to use one of these urinals. And it worked. It was this tiny little amount of money paid by tons of people constantly throughout the entire republic, empire, as well as the city of Rome itself. Another interesting thing during Vespasian's reign that was built was the Flavian Amphitheater, built from the year 72 and finished under his son Titus's rule in 80. He, of course, started it being built, and of course we've already talked about it. It is the Colosseum, right? And we've already talked about all of its dimensions, so there's no need to talk about it again in this lecture. But of course, here it is, just in case I hadn't already spoken about it. Here's the information if you missed it. And so moving on, let's talk a little bit more about the Jewish revolt back in Syria during Vespasian's reign, because this is another issue that happens during Vespasian's reign, and we've already started it. And Titus and Vespasian both thought they had finished the, revolt, but they really hadn't. It's actually continued. For the past 3 years, it's been in small amounts in Syria. And so, over in Syria, in these areas right here. And so, mostly in this area down here, but it's been throughout this whole Syria, Judea area, okay? And so, the Jewish people are still revolting. They had been defeated at the city of Jerusalem in the year 70 by Titus, Vespasian's son, and then when Titus won that battle and destroyed the city of Jerusalem, of course it would be rebuilt later on, he kind of came back to Rome to celebrate his father becoming emperor. And so they thought it was over. And for about 3 years, it kind of was. It kind of died down to the point where there was only small fighting throughout Judea and throughout the area of Jerusalem between the Romans and the Jewish people that were fighting back. Eventually, however, it would escalate to the point of this place called the Siege of Masada. And this big giant mesa here is Masada. And so let's talk a little bit about it. You can actually see former Roman camps here and here. These big square areas are former Roman camps. And same with this area here. And so let's talk about the Siege of Masada and how it happened. Well, after the Great Revolt, or during it rather, Legion 10 was left behind by Titus to defend and Judea, as well as defeat the remaining Jewish rebels. Well, eventually, Legion 10 thought they had been victorious. But, after 3 years of thinking they were really victorious and had basically won everything, 960 remaining Jewish rebels, including their family members, included in the 960, take refuge at the fortress of Masada. Okay, and this is Masada, this big giant mesa or plateau in the middle of the desert. And of course there's a couple mountains and stuff around, but you can kind of see here is a mountain. But it's basically flat desert otherwise, and some rocky outcrops and stuff. And this thing's huge. This is a small little village or a couple buildings on top of it, okay? So this is a massive, massive area. And you can kind of see this little white trail here. That is actually a path up the side of the mountain. You can actually kind of see it along here. And so there's a small trail up to it. Otherwise, it's steep cliffs, or relatively steep cliffs with all the rocky outcroppings, right? Not very easy to get up it. This area right here was not there at the time. We'll talk about what this is in a bit. Well, these 960 Jewish rebels decided to flee and settle on the top of Masada, where there was a small temple and a small few buildings and like a goat farm up there. And so these people, the Jewish rebels, started deciding to rebuild their civilization here and fight against the Romans when they could. And they were going to rebuild and start planning from here, and then eventually send soldiers and attack against the Romans. Well, eventually, the Legion 10 decides to attack Masada and stop this Jewish rebellion right away. And so they siege the plateau or mesa of Masada. Now, there's only one way up the side of this, all the way up to the top, and that is by taking a small little path along basically this route here, and then it kind of like goes around this edge here, all the way around here, and eventually on this side it goes really far down to the bottom and eventually gets to the bottom. And so you can actually climb the very long ledge, okay, and this small trail all the way up it. However, an army cannot do that. This little trail was like 1 person wide. And so, if the rebels wanted to, okay, they could easily throw rocks or shoot arrows or spears and throw spears and stuff down at the soldiers trying to walk on this trail, and they would basically fall off and die. And that was not the way for the Romans to be able to do it. They tried several times to do that way, and they realized they could not do it. So eventually, the Romans decide that they're going to do something else, and that is to build a giant dirt ramp up the side of this mesa. And that's what this pile of dirt is here today, this pile of soil that you see here. This was originally not like this. This is what it looks like today, and this is what it looks like if you're actually at the top of it, and looking down on it with a camera. And so this is where the Romans would have been building, and they just would have taken soil, bucket of soil, bucket of soil, bucket of soil, until they eventually built this giant, giant ramp of soil, where they had a battering ram on wheels roll up the side of the ramp, all the way up to the side, up to the top, where the tiny little wall was around the entire length of this thing. There was a small wall, about 6 feet high, all the way up around the whole thing. And once they got to the top, they were going to take the big battering ram, the big log, and knock down the wall, and all the soldiers would then flood into the top of the mesa and arrest the Jewish rebels. Well, they do this. They build this entire earthen ramp with a stone surface. They actually layer stone along the top of it so they can roll this wooden battering ram all the way up it on wheels. And so they get to the top, and as they're about to get to the top, they stop the night before, and they realize the next morning they're going to do it, that they're going to wheel their battering ram all the way up, and they're going to batter their way through. The Jewish rebels realize that the revolt is over. And so the Jewish rebels, the night that the Roman army is about to attack, or the night before they are going to attack in the morning, the Jewish rebels decide that they're going to kill every single one of themselves. That all 967 Jewish rebels, because there were 967 Jewish rebels, end up killing themselves. They actually poison themselves, and only 5 to 7 of them, 2 women and 5 children, okay, actually survive. And this is according to the Roman Jewish historian Flavius Josephus. Flavius Josephus is the Roman historian that told us about this, and told us that about 2 women and 5 children decided not to take poison, and that all of their families did. And this right here shows you kind of the top of the mesa here and kind of the mountains and stuff, and that's the sea. That's the Mediterranean Sea right over there. And so it's actually quite large, right? And the little trail you can kind of see along the edge here. And so the Romans really had to use that battering ram to get to the top. Well, when the Romans batter their way through in the morning, they find the bodies of 960 Jewish rebels here on the top of Masada, all dead from poison, and they kind of go, why? Because they were going to arrest them, yes, they might have killed a few if they fought back, but the families, the women and children, were going to be spared. But even women and children killed themselves, thinking that they were all going to be killed by the Romans, and Romans didn't do that. They might enslave them, but that's about it, and they weren't going to kill them. But 5 to 7 women, or 2 women and 5 children, according to Flavius Josephus, survive and tell the story of what happened. They are, of course, captured by the Romans, and then the Romans kind of bring them down to the bottom of the Masada, and they say, you just go home, go somewhere else. We're sorry, basically, is what ends up happening. And so nothing really happens to those 2 women and 5 children. So it's really a tragedy. Today, and regarded as a tragedy on both sides. They both realize that this rebellion really didn't have to end this way. But obviously, again, you can see how big this ramp is, and it still lasts today, even with erosion, just falling apart over time. It's fallen apart, but it used to go all the way to the top here. And this is the side that you would have been seeing in this right here. Okay, and so that is the end of the Jewish revolt, and of course we hear quite a lot of it from Flavius Josephus as well as other Roman historians. I believe Flavius Josephus was actually there, or someone else was that wrote a history about it, and Flavius Josephus wrote afterwards. Well, eventually, Vespasian dies of natural causes, and his young son, Titus, the oldest of the 2 sons, actually takes over. Titus actually lived from 39 CE to 81 CE, actually died relatively young, and he was emperor from 79 to 81. Well, of course, he continues the Flavian Dynasty. He is the second member of the Flavian Dynasty. He was the one that helped put down the Jewish revolt. He actually ended up ordering the Legion 10 to go and attack Masada, but that's about it. And, well, his father did, along with him. And he had been putting down the Jewish revolt beforehand, when his father went off to become emperor. Well, eventually he becomes emperor himself, and he becomes known as father to his people, because he becomes very popular with the people, because he is constantly dealing with natural disasters that happen under his time as emperorship, during his very short, brief 2.5 to 3 year emperorship. There is first a fire in Rome that lasts for an entire 3 days and burns a large portion of Rome. We are not sure exactly what happened with this fire, probably an accident, because there is not reports of Praetorian Guard running around with torches, and there is no blaming the Christians for this one either. Of course, again, Nero was about the only emperor that did that. Well, to that extent for this period of time. Afterwards, there would be a couple other emperors that would also persecute Christians, and we'll talk about that later. So fire for 3 days in Rome. That's a long fire. It burned most of the city down, and he, of course, had to rebuild it as quickly as possible, as well as tend to the wounded from the fires, as well as tend to the homeless that had lost their homes and businesses during that period. And so that's one of the reasons why he becomes known as the father to his people, because he's constantly taking care of them. Then a plague breaks out through all of the Roman Empire. It's a horrible, horrible plague and wipes out tens of thousands of people. Throughout this entire empire. And then, finally, in August 24th of 79 CE, or later on, possibly October 24th, because we know it's the 24th, but we're not sure if it's August or October, because there's conflicting dates on which one it was, there is something very big of a disaster that ends up happening, and you might already know of it, but it is this. Mount Vesuvius exploding. It's a volcanic eruption. And so this is one of my little puns about the sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And here's the rock and roll of all the lava coming down it from this horrible disaster. And so let's talk a little bit about Mount Vesuvius's volcanic eruption. And it happens, we know, during the fall or autumn of 79 CE. And again, it could have happened either in August or October. We're not exactly sure. There's conflicting dates in Roman articles about it. And so the cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum, here's Pompeii and Herculaneum was over here, were two of the cities mostly affected by it. Herculaneum right here, Pompeii here, and Mount Vesuvius right here. And of course Oplontis would have been also affected by it, but Oplontis was much smaller than both the city of Pompeii and the city of Herculaneum. And so that is why Pompeii and Herculaneum are the ones mentioned. Historically, everybody has always said that it happened during August of the year 79 CE, okay? But recently, new dating methods, okay, due to the historian Pliny, have been found. New evidence, thanks to this historian, which we've known about for a very long time. We found that Pliny writes in one of his books and historical documents and letters about his uncle in October, going from the town of Mycenium, okay, that saw the eruption happening, okay, from miles away. And this is in Italy. This is the part of Italy. It's not far away from Rome, which would be right here. Mount Vesuvius. This is where also Spartacus led his revolt, or not led his revolt, but had his revolt sit and wait for a while, right? And so this volcano erupted, and Pliny's uncle actually took a boat. He was a boat owner, and actually took his boat over to Herculaneum to pick up survivors from Herculaneum and then row back to Mycenium. However, his uncle never returned from that trip, probably because of either ash clouds, falling rock, or something else. And so let's talk about what happens when a volcano erupts, because a lot of people have this idea that the volcano erupts and it's absolutely horrible because of all the lava. That's not true. Yes, that's horrible, but really it's this multi-day or multi-hour, depending on how long the eruption lasts, process. And so a lot of historical, movies with, disaster movies and stuff of volcanoes erupting have it wrong. This is what actually happens. Day 1, the volcano erupts, and temperatures in the area around the volcano of Mount Vesuvius reach around 250 degrees to 280 degrees. That's hot. If you somehow don't die by literally baking to death in the area of Mount Vesuvius and the volcano, ash clouds and falling rock are going to hit you. Falling rock, bad, right? It's literally chunks of rock, anywhere from like fist-sized to smaller, like pebble-sized, to size of pumpkins, hitting you. And so that's kind of terrifying on its own, of course, as you can see, spewing all these lava bits, or bits of falling rock. Not to mention ash clouds. The ash clouds are these massive, massive clouds of ash that don't actually hit like this kind of regular cloud, like mist or fog. No, it's much thicker than that. It's like as if this giant wall of air hits you, which is just solidly ash. Okay? This solid ash cloud hitting you and enveloping everything. And we're going to show some pictures of that in a minute. We do know that the temperatures of 250 degrees to 280 degrees were beginning to melt roofs and cook everything else in the area around the area of Mount Vesuvius. Poisonous gas from the ash clouds also prevents escape because you're basically coughing to death on this poisonous ash cloud gas. Death. Absolutely horrible. On day 2, if you somehow survived day 1, temperatures now reach 360 degrees to 680 degrees due to 2 lava flows, one flowing this way and another one flowing to Herculaneum. Massive, massive rivers of lava. We do know that people in Herculaneum and Pompeii stayed during the eruption because of these. These are, of course, not actual people, but these are now Roman casts, okay? Italian casts of people. As you can see, a child, men, women, a horse, a person crouching here. This was been what happens if the ash cloud hits you. That's what happens if the ash cloud hits you. It's not you cough on it and stuff and get covered in this tiny little, dirt. It's this massive cloud of ash that does not go away. And it's also boilingly hot and gets stuck to you, and you probably die from impact of the ash cloud. Let alone people that took refuge in their homes during the day 1. Their roofs would have been melting, and everything else inside would have been cooking. And if you somehow survived that, then the poison gas or the temperatures the next day would have cooked you. And so people died in these 2 towns in droves. A few people, of course, saw the eruption happening and smoke kind of coming out of the top of it for the previous day or 2, and so evacuated, but many people did not. And so let's continue on with a little bit closer map of this. Again, just showing you the ash cloud coverage is this black area. This entire area was covered by ash. This entire area. Massive area. This is 10 miles. 10 miles out to here. So that's about 30 to 40 miles away. Moving on. The excavation of Pompeii. Now, Pompeii has actually become excavated by Roman historians quite a lot, and it has been rediscovered in the year 1599 CE, okay? And then they started excavating it, as in archaeologists and historians actually went to it in the year 1748, and have been excavating it ever since, and it is almost an absolutely perfect map of what the city looks like, because we've uncovered it bit by bit by bit. And so we actually know what all the little kind of city streets and buildings and all look like, because they have people and stuff like this in the middle of their everyday jobs, or some of them hiding and terrifying, and in terror, all hiding from the ash. We've got multiple cities and maps of it here, and as you can see, the city, we know exactly what is in it, and it's a very good thing for historians today, this excavation of Pompeii, because we know what Roman society was, because it basically was if Roman society was all of a sudden frozen in time. middle of a disaster, which was absolutely horrifying, but for us historians, we look at it as this is something good, so we can learn a little bit about the people that lived there during that period of time. This is Mount Vesuvius today, right there, happy as a clam. There's a city right here. This is the city of Pompeii today, right here. Built up, cruise ships, rebuilt, everything, modern day. Yes, this volcano could erupt, but again, people say, why would you build there? Well, why do we build where you can get hit by a hurricane like we just had, or even worse ones? Why do we build in the middle of plains in the middle of America with tornadoes? Why do we build in California with forest fires and earthquakes? Because there's always going to be a disaster somewhere where you're at, right? And so in this case, same with Hawaii and many other places in the world, volcanoes is their issue. Moving on, eventually, Titus gets sick in the year 81 CE, okay? And eventually, his brother, being a big younger brother, tells his brother's doctors, don't help him. Titus ends up having a fever. And Domitian, the younger brother of Titus, tells the doctors, do not help him, that he'll get better on his own. It's fine. It'll go away. Well, he knew exactly what was happening, and Domitian ends up basically killing Titus via this fever. It was, of course, a fever. We don't know if it was poison or not. We just do know that Titus got sick, and so Titus died very young in the year 81 CE. And, of course, Domitian takes over. He, of course, lived from the year 51 CE to the 96 CE. And Domitian becomes emperor in 81 CE and rules until 96 when he dies. He is the third and final member of the Flavian Dynasty. He was not a particularly nice person. In addition to basically killing his brother, he also demanded to be called Lord and God by everybody he met and everybody he knew, including all of his servants and the Senate. He absolutely hated the Senate. He killed many of the Senate members, as well as many others throughout all of the city of Rome and other Romans that were against him. He completely persecuted Christians. He's one of the other two that I was talking about, along with Nero, that persecuted Christians. There's three of them really did. Domitian, Nero, and another one we'll talk about later on. In fact, St. John, one of the saints and one of the popes, I believe St. John was eventually, he actually boiled St. John in oil. He actually took oil, a pot of oil, and dipped St. John in it and basically boiled him alive inside the pot of oil to kill him. He definitely hated Christians, and the Flavian Amphitheater, the Colosseum, was used by Domitian to execute Christians. But for the most part, beforehand, under Titus and Vespasian, that didn't happen. They were normally slaves or gladiators that were trained to fight in the Colosseum that died there, not Christians being basically sacrificed or killed there on purpose. But Domitian did do that. Domitian also gave the soldiers a raise, plus huge amounts of money on himself, because he basically wanted to spend it making a new palace, as well as a bunch of baths for himself, his whole new bathhouse, and a bunch of other things, tons of games in Rome, and during this period of about 15 years of his rule, from 81 again to 96, we end up having him rack up a massive amount of debt. Eventually, his own wife, the Praetorian Guard, and the Senate, as well as a couple members of his advisors, plot to assassinate him, and eventually members of the Praetorian Guard, with the help of the Senate and his wife, actually stab him to death in his own bedroom 8 times, killing him in the year 96 BC, CE. And eventually, the most qualified person to run things was actually one of his own advisors, a man named Nerva, who was kind of part of the plot to kill him, but really, the Senate kind of were like, look, we really like you. You should be in charge. And so they put him in charge. And so next time in Lecture 20, we will talk about the 5 good emperors and the basically collapsing part of the Roman Empire, which are all going to be chosen with merit. And that is going to start with the Emperor Nerva, who again was one of Domitian's advisors. So I know this lecture was long, but I hope you enjoyed part of it. I know there was some cool stories or fun stories and some interesting facts. So have a great day.